The wind was not a sound, it was a weight. It pressed against Elias Vance with the force of a physical blow, driving shards of ice into his skin. He leaned into it, one hand gripping the reins, the other held tight to the thick mane of his horse. The animal, Copper, lowered his head and pushed forward, each step a deliberate, powerful act of trust. All around them, the world had vanished into a shrieking vortex of white. Visibility was measured in feet, then inches. The ground, once familiar pasture, was now a treacherous landscape of accumulating ice. It coated every branch, every rock, every blade of dormant grass in a thickening crystal shell. Elias could hear the forest screaming as ancient limbs, heavy with the impossible weight, groaned and then snapped with reports like rifle shots. He did not look toward the sound. His eyes were fixed on a point ahead, a destination that existed more in his memory than in his sight. Copper stumbled, his iron-shod hooves finding no purchase on the slick surface. Elias pulled him up, his voice a low murmur against the gale. "Easy, boy. Almost there." The horse responded, muscles bunching as he found his footing and resumed his labored march. They were a single entity, moving against a hostile world. A man and his horse, bound by years of shared hardship and unspoken understanding. Then he saw it. A low, dark shape rising from the snow-blasted earth. It was not a building in the conventional sense. It was a mound, a gentle swell in the landscape, barely distinguishable from the surrounding drifts. But from its face protruded a heavy, iron-strapped oak door, and to one side, a short, stout chimney of fieldstone, from which no smoke yet rose. This was the place. This was the folly. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and clumsy. The iron was cold enough to steel the skin from his fingertips. With a final, desperate heave, the door swung inward, revealing a yawning darkness. He led Copper into the shelter, the horse's hooves clattering on a stone ramp before silencing on packed earth. Elias slammed the great door shut. The roar of the blizzard was instantly cut off, replaced by a profound and ringing silence. The only sounds were the horse's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his own heart. They were safe. The first test had been passed. 6 months earlier, the air had been thick with the scent of pine and warm dust. Elias Vance stood in the county surveyor's office, a hand-drawn schematic spread across the wide oak desk. Sheriff Brody leaned over it, his brow furrowed in a mask of polite confusion. The surveyor, a man named Peters, simply stared, a small, incredulous smile playing on his lips.
"Let me get this straight, Vance," Sheriff Brody began, tapping a finger on the drawing. "You want to build your root cellar before you build your cabin?" "It's not just a root cellar," Elias corrected him, his voice calm and even. "It's the primary dwelling. The cabin is for summer use. This is for winter." Peters let out a short, dry laugh. "A dwelling? It's a hole in the ground. You plan to live like a badger?" Elias met his gaze without rancor. "Badgers survive the winter." He then pointed to a complex, winding series of lines drawn through a cross-section of the earthen roof. "This is the important part, the flue. It won't vent straight up. It will run through the mass of the roof, heating the earth itself. The entire structure will become a thermal battery, holding the heat from a small fire for days." Sheriff Brody straightened up, stroking his chin. "Vance, I've known you for 10 years. You were the best scout the cavalry had, and you know this territory better than any man alive. But this is peculiar. People will talk. They already do, Elias said flatly. That doesn't change the weather. What about the weather? Peters asked, his tone dripping with condescension. We have winters. We burn wood. We survive. It's been done that way since the first settlers came through this valley. The winters you've seen are mild, Elias explained, his gaze distant, as if seeing a calendar of seasons only he possessed. I've spoken with the old Ute hunters. They have stories, passed down, of winters that come every 30 or 40 years. A white winter, they call it. Not of snow, but of ice. A storm that freezes everything it touches, that snaps the oldest trees and buries the valleys for weeks. My father saw the edge of one as a boy.
Further north. It collapsed cabins. It starved out entire herds of buffalo. Peters scoffed. Old Indian stories. You're going to live in a cave because of some campfire tale? I'm going to live in a shelter engineered for the environment I'm in, not the one I wish I was in, Elias replied. The weight of the earth provides insulation. The stone arch provides strength that a timber roof never could. The heated mass will keep the internal temperature above freezing, even if the fire goes out for a day. It is logical. Sheriff Brody sighed, a man caught between respecting the messenger and disbelieving the message. All right, Vance, it's your land, your money. You can build a house out of straw for all I care. Just don't be surprised when folks call it Vance's Folly. The name stuck. As Elias began his work, the mockery from the nearby town became a constant, low hum of amusement. He ignored it. He had a different calendar to keep, and its deadline was the first hard frost. The work began not with an axe, but with a shovel. He chose his site with meticulous care. The southern face of a low, rolling hill, protected from the northern winds and positioned to catch the low winter sun. He spent a week just observing, marking the path of the sun with stakes, studying the drainage patterns after a summer rain. The location had to be perfect. He excavated by hand, assisted by Copper, who dragged a small stone boat to haul away the earth. He did not simply dig a pit. He carved into the hillside, going deeper than any frost line had ever reached in living memory. He dug down 10 feet into a dense, stable layer of clay that was cool to the touch even on the hottest days. This clay, he knew, was the foundation. It was impervious to water and held its shape. The walls of his excavation were perfectly vertical, shaved smooth with the flat of his spade. For the base of the structure, he laid a foundation of large, flat river stones, dry stacked with a precision that left no gaps. On top of this, he began to build the lower walls, not of stone, but of thick lodgepole pine logs he had felled and cured himself the previous year. He squared them with a broadaxe and an adze, and joined them at the corners with V-notches so tight they seemed to have grown that way. These log walls rose only 4 feet from the stone floor, a solid, immovable base. The true madness in the eyes of the town was the roof. He was not using timber beams. He was building a Roman arch out of field stone. He spent a month gathering the right stones from the surrounding land, checking each one for fractures, judging its shape and weight. He built a temporary wooden form, a curved skeleton that would dictate the shape of the arch. Then, stone by stone, he began to build. He made his own mortar from the excavated clay, fine sand, and horsehair for binding. He laid each stone with painstaking care, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. The arch grew inward from the log walls, a self-supporting curve of immense strength. The physics were simple and ancient. The weight of the earth that would eventually be piled on top would not push the arch down. It would push it together, making it stronger.
The keystone, the final wedge-shaped rock at the apex of the arch, was set into place at sunset one evening. Elias tapped it home with a wooden mallet. The sound was a solid, satisfying thud. He stood back and admired his work. It was a structure of pure compressive strength. It would not break. With the arch complete, he dismantled the wooden form from inside. The stone held. The arch held. Now came the genius and the folly. The flue. He built a small, efficient wood stove near the front of the shelter, but its stovepipe did not go straight up. Instead, he connected it to a network of wide clay pipes he had fired himself. This network snaked back and forth through a 3-foot layer of packed earth and gravel that he laid on top of the stone arch. The smoke and hot gas from the fire would be forced to travel over 60 feet through this masonry maze before exiting a small chimney at the far end of the mound. A passing neighbor, John Miller, had watched him for an hour one day, shaking his head. "You're going to choke yourself out, Vance," he'd said. "A chimney needs a straight draw." "A straight draw wastes heat," Elias had replied, without stopping his work. "This way, the heat stays in the earth. The smoke will still draw, it will just be slow, and cold when it comes out." Miller had just walked away, laughing. A cold smoke chimney. Another piece of Vance's madness. After the flue system was buried, Elias added the final layers. He covered the entire mound with a thick coating of the sticky blue clay he'd dug from the base, creating a waterproof membrane. Over that, he laid another foot of soil, and finally, he carefully replaced the original sod, cutting and fitting it so perfectly that within a few weeks of rain, the structure had all but vanished back into the hillside. It was just a green mound with a door, a small window of thick glass, and a chimney. To one side, he built a similar, smaller structure, connected by a short underground passage. It was a stable for copper, equally protected. He spent the last month of autumn stockpiling. He filled one side of the shelter with split, seasoned oak and pine, enough for 3 months of continuous burning. He stocked shelves with sacks of flour, beans, salted meat, and crates of potatoes and apples from his small orchard. He built a clever ventilation system with 2 small baffled pipes at opposite ends of the dwelling that could be opened or closed to allow a slow, steady circulation of fresh air without creating a draft. He was not just building a shelter. He was creating a self-sustaining ecosystem. By the first snowfall in November, the work was done. The community had grown bored with his project, moving on to other gossip. The folly was now just a strange lump in his pasture, a monument to one man's peculiar obsession. Elias felt no need to justify himself. He simply watched the sky, noted the behavior of the animals, and waited. The signs were subtle at first. The squirrels, usually bold and chattering, were manic in their gathering, their movements jerky and desperate. He saw beaver reinforcing their dams with mud and logs to a height he had never witnessed before. The usual autumn haze was absent. Instead, the sky held a high, thin, crystalline clarity that seemed to make distant mountains appear unnervingly close. He rode Copper into town for supplies one last time in early December. The air was still, but it held a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was a cold that felt ancient. Men on the street corner nodded curtly, their eyes sliding away from him. He was an outcast, not for any crime, but for his refusal to conform to their shared reality. They saw a mild winter coming. He saw the tightening of a spring. "Still living in that mole hole, Vance?" a man called out from the doorway of the general store. Elias just nodded, loading his sacks onto Copper's back. "It's warm." "Not as warm as my hearth," the man laughed, and others joined in. Elias swung into the saddle.
He looked at the men, at their sturdy, log-built homes, with their proud stone chimneys puffing gentle streams of white smoke into the cold air. They were good men. They were competent. They were also complacent. They had mistaken a cycle of calm for a permanent state of being. As he rode out of town, he noticed the birds were gone. Not just the migratory geese, which had left a month early, but the small, hardy winter birds, the sparrows, the juncos, the finches. The woods were utterly silent. Even Copper seemed to feel it. The horse was skittish, his ears swiveling, his breath pluming in the unnaturally still air. He trusted his horse's instincts more than any man's opinion. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. It was just waiting to fall. That night, the temperature plummeted. A strange, greenish-yellow light appeared on the northern horizon, a sickly aurora that flickered without beauty. Elias did his final chores. He brought in extra water from the well, topping off his barrels. He gave Copper a double ration of oats. He banked the fire in the stove, laid out his lamp and oil, and sat by the thick glass window, watching the sky. The catastrophe did not begin with a gentle flurry. It began with a sound, a low, rising hum from the north that grew into a deep, guttural roar. The wind arrived like a solid wall, striking the small window with a force that made the thick glass groan. Then came the ice. It wasn't snow. It was rain, supercooled in the upper atmosphere, freezing instantly on contact with any surface. Within an hour, the world outside was encased. The window became opaque, sealed behind a lens of growing ice. The only light came from his oil lamp, which cast a steady, golden glow on the log walls and stone floor of his sanctuary. He placed a hand on the earthen wall. It was cool, but not cold. He walked over to the stove and added a single, small log. The fire was burning with a slow, steady draw. The flue was working. The heat was being absorbed by the tons of earth above and around him. He went through the short passage to check on his horse. Copper was calm, standing in his stall on a bed of clean straw, munching on hay. The stable was dim and cool, but the life-threatening chill of the outside world did not penetrate it. The horse nudged his master's shoulder, a simple, reassuring gesture. Here, in their shared refuge, the storm was just a distant, muffled rage. For 2 days, he and Copper existed in their subterranean bubble of calm. The temperature inside the main chamber held steady. It was not hot, but it was a comfortable, livable warmth that radiated gently from the walls, floor, and ceiling. He ate, read by lamplight, and tended to his horse. He could hear the storm, a constant, low-frequency vibration that transmitted through the earth, and the occasional, violent crack of a falling tree. But these were the sounds of another world. On the morning of the 3rd day, a new sound intruded. It was faint, a desperate, high-pitched cry, almost lost in the low growl of the wind. Elias froze, listening. It came again, closer this time. A human voice. He unbarred the heavy door and pushed. It wouldn't budge. A thick rampart of ice and frozen snow had sealed him in. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar he kept for the purpose and set to work. It took him 20 minutes of brutal, exhausting labor to crack the seal. When the door finally scraped open a foot, the storm blasted in, a maelstrom of ice pellets and killing cold. Framed in the opening was a terrifying sight. It was his neighbor, John Miller, his face a mask of frost and frozen tears. He was half carrying, half dragging his wife, Mary, while their 2 small children clung to his legs. They were covered in ice, their clothes frozen stiff.
Vance, help us! Miller cried, his voice hoarse. Our chimney, it iced over. The cabin filled with smoke. We tried to get out. The roof, it's collapsing. Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled them inside, one by one, into the relative warmth of his shelter, and then threw his shoulder against the door, forcing it shut against the storm's fury. The Millers collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently, their faces pale with shock and hypothermia. Mary was weeping silently. The children were too cold to even cry. He worked quickly, his movements efficient and sure.
He stripped off their frozen outer layers, which cracked and broke like glass. He wrapped them in the thick wool blankets he had stored. He heated water on the stove and made them drink a warm, sweet broth. He sat the children closest to the stove, their small bodies soaking in the direct heat. John Miller stared around the shelter, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the solid log walls, the impossibly strong stone arch overhead, the vast stores of food and wood. He touched a hand to the earthen wall, feeling the gentle, pervasive warmth. It's warm in here, he stammered, as if stating a miracle. The whole place is warm. It's the flu, Elias said simply, ladling more broth into a cup. The earth holds the heat. Miller looked at the man he had openly mocked. He remembered his own sturdy cabin, the symbol of his competence, now a frozen death trap with a collapsed roof and a smoke-filled interior. He had followed the conventional wisdom. He had built what everyone else had built, and it had failed him. This place, this folly, this ridiculous badger hole was a haven of life in the midst of a world of ice. "We thought you were mad," Miller whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Everyone did." Elias handed him the cup of broth. "Drink this. Get warm." Vindication was not a feeling of triumph. It was the quiet, somber satisfaction of seeing his family safe. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. The wind died first, leaving behind an eerie, absolute silence. Elias cracked the door open again. The world he saw was unrecognizable. It was a landscape sculpted from glass. Every surface was coated in an armor of clear ice, inches thick. The sun, when it rose, struck a million facets, blinding in its brilliance and utterly without warmth. The forest was a scene of devastation. Great oaks and pines that had stood for a century had been shattered, their limbs littering the ground like broken matchsticks. The town, in the distance, was a collection of broken shapes. He could see collapsed roofs, splintered walls. There was no smoke rising from any chimney. Not a single one. He left the Millers resting in the warmth of the shelter and went outside, Copper trailing cautiously behind him. The horses' hooves crunched on the icy crust. The air was frigid, but clean. The silence was profound. It was the silence of a world that had ceased to function. He was halfway to the town when he saw a figure approaching, moving slowly and with great difficulty. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the exhausted, haggard form of Sheriff Brody. The sheriff's face was rimmed with frost, his expression one of deep shock. Brody stopped 20 feet from Elias, his gaze fixed not on the man, but on the mound behind him. He saw the wisp of vapor rising from the stone chimney. He saw the solid, undamaged door. He saw the Miller children, wrapped in blankets, emerge from the opening to stare at the transformed world. The sheriff looked at the broken remains of John Miller's cabin, its roof caved in under the impossible weight of the ice. He looked back at the simple, unassuming mound of earth. He finally met Elias Vance's eyes. There was no "I told you so" in the scout's gaze. There was only a quiet, weary dignity. "Vance." Brody's voice was a rough croak. "We were wrong. My God, we were all wrong." He gestured vaguely toward the devastated town. "We lost people. The Jacksons. Their cabin caught fire when the chimney smoke backed up. The widow Hemlock froze in her own bed. Roofs collapsed everywhere. We couldn't keep the fires lit. Chimneys are all blocked with ice." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the ingenious structure. "This place. Your folly. It held. You knew. You actually knew this was coming." "I saw the signs," Elias said. It was the only explanation he offered. "We all saw them, Vance," the sheriff said, his voice filled with a terrible self-recrimination. "We just called it weather. You called it a warning." He looked past Elias toward the saved family. "You saved the Millers. You may be the only one who came through this with everything you started with." In the weeks that followed, the survivors of the Great Ice Storm looked upon Elias Vance with a new kind of reverence. The mockery was gone, replaced by a desperate desire for knowledge. Men who had once laughed at his mole hole now came to him, hats in hand, asking how he built it. They asked about the stone arch, about the winding flue, about the earth insulation. Elias shared his knowledge freely. He held no grudges. He drew his schematics in the dirt for them, explaining the principles of thermal mass and compressive strength. He showed them how to read the signs of the land, how to listen to the warnings of the natural world instead of the comfortable reassurances of the crowd. He taught them that a shelter should be designed for the worst day, not the average one. They began to rebuild, but they did not rebuild the same way. The new structures that rose in the valley were different. Many were built into the sides of hills, using the earth itself as a shield. The simple, inefficient fireplaces were replaced with smarter designs, with masonry heaters that captured the warmth before it could escape up the chimney. They called it the Vance method. Years passed. The Great Ice Storm became a legend, a benchmark of hardship against which all other winters were measured. And the mound in Elias Vance's pasture became a landmark. Vance's Folly was never called that again. It was known as the Winter Haven. It stood as a silent, grass-covered testament to a man who had listened to the wisdom of the earth. In subsequent hard winters, it served as a communal shelter, saving other families caught unprepared. Elias Vance lived out his days in quiet dignity, respected by the community that had once shunned him. He never married, his only constant companion, the faithful horse, Copper, who lived to a ripe old age, grazing peacefully on the green roof of the shelter that had saved them both. The legacy of the scout was not written in books or carved on a grand monument. It was written into the very architecture of the valley. It was in the low-slung, earth-sheltered homes that dotted the landscape, each one a quiet acknowledgement that the line between wisdom and madness is often drawn by the storm. For those who survived, the lesson was clear and enduring. The crowd can keep you warm with its consensus, but it is the lone visionary, the one willing to be called a fool, who builds the shelter that will last the winter. The Folly had become the foundation.